The Silver Spur Saloon had never been so quiet. 30 men filled that smoke-stained room on the evening of April 14th, 1883, and not one of them made a sound when the door swung open and the woman stepped inside. Tin cups froze halfway to bearded lips. Card hands went face down on sticky tables. Even the piano player, a gap-toothed old man named Cutter who claimed he had never stopped playing for anything short of a gunshot, let his fingers go still on the yellowed keys. 30 men sat in the amber lamplight of Redemption, Texas, and stared at Delia Bancroft as though she were a ghost who had walked through the wrong wall. And then there was Phineas Barker. He rose from his chair in the corner, the dark corner, the one where a man sat when he did not want to be seen, and he stood to his full height, and the simple gravity of that single act sent a crack of heat straight through Delia's chest that she was not at all prepared for. One man in a room of 30 had the decency, the instinct, or the nerve to stand when she walked in, the way a man stands for someone worth standing for. She did not know his name yet. She did not know the dark past carved into the lines around his eyes, or the secrets he carried in the battered leather satchel beneath his chair, or the hidden motive that had brought him to Redemption ahead of her. She did not know that the letter she carried in her coat pocket, the letter that had ruined absolutely everything she had believed about her own life, had his name threaded through it like a trap wire. All she knew in that scalding, suspended moment was that one man had stood, and that it would change everything. Delia Bancroft had not planned to be in Redemption, Texas. She had not planned any of the last 6 weeks of her life, not the way plans were supposed to work, with logic and order, and outcomes a reasonable person could anticipate. She was 26 years old, which meant she was old enough to have learned that life rarely cooperated with plans, but she had not quite learned it thoroughly enough for what had happened in St. Louis to feel like anything other than a betrayal so complete it had physically knocked her sideways. She had sat on the train platform at St. Louis Union Station on a raw March morning, with a carpet bag between her feet and a letter in her lap, and a feeling in her stomach that she could only describe as the specific cold of discovering that everything you built your last 2 years on was a deliberate lie. The letter had arrived 3 weeks before her planned wedding to Martin Aldridge Greer, a man she had believed to be a land surveyor of modest but honest means, a man who had courted her with a patience and a gentleness that she had taken for integrity. The letter had not come from a spurned lover or a jealous rival. It had come from a Pinkerton agency operating out of Kansas City, addressed to her father, and it had outlined in the dry, careful language of professional investigators that Martin Aldridge Greer was not a land surveyor at all. He was a land forger. He had been falsifying property deeds across 4 counties in Missouri and Kansas, selling parcels of land he did not own to settlers desperate for ground to build their futures on. He had already done this to 2 women before Delia, marrying them under false names, draining their family funds under the pretense of investment, and disappearing before the deeds came apart. She had not confronted him with the letter. Her father had tried to, but Martin had been gone before the confrontation could be arranged, vanished like smoke off still water. And so Delia Bancroft, the daughter of a St. Louis cotton merchant who had died 3 months after the letter arrived, suddenly robbed of both her father and her future in the same bitter season, had found herself with a carpet bag, a train ticket purchased on an impulse she could not entirely explain, and the name of a town in West Texas that her father had mentioned once as a place where good land could still be bought honest. Redemption, Texas. She had thought the name was either a very good omen or a very bad joke. The town itself was neither dramatic nor welcoming. It was 43 buildings arranged in a rough grid along a single wide main street, positioned in the rolling scrub country south of the Caprock Escarpment, where the wind came off the plains with enough persistence to make a person feel personally argued with. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a doctor's office that doubled as the town recorder, a small church that leaned slightly to the east as though listening for something, a two-story hotel called the Pico's House, and the Silver Spur Saloon, which was the most structurally sound building on the main street and the one where, at 7 in the evening on April 14, 1883, 30 men were sitting when Delia Bancroft walked through the door. She had not meant to walk into the saloon. She had meant to walk into the hotel, but the hotel's front door faced east and the saloon's front door faced west, and the sun was in her eyes, and she was tired down to the marrow from 4 days of stagecoach travel out of San Angelo, and she opened the wrong door. She stood in the doorway of the Silver Spur and understood her mistake in approximately 2 seconds, and in that same 2 seconds she understood something else. One man had stood up. He was tall, though not extravagantly so. He wore a dark coat that had seen better decades, a working man's coat with the collar turned against weather and the elbows worn pale. His hat was on the table rather than his head, and his hair was dark and cut plainly, and his jaw carried the kind of shadow that came from days on the road rather than vanity. His eyes, even across that smoky room, were a shade of gray-green that Delia registered with the part of her brain that catalogued things before her conscious mind could censor them. The color of the sky when a real storm is still 2 hours out, full of unspent force. He stood. He just stood in that dark corner, while every other man in the room sat gaping, and his expression was not a leer or a smirk or the particular look of a man calculating an opportunity. It was something simpler and rarer than any of those things. It was recognition, as though he had known someone worth standing for was going to walk through that door, and here she was. Delia straightened her back, because she had never in her adult life let anyone see her flinch, and she said, with a composure she was fairly proud of under the circumstances, "I beg your pardon. I appear to have found the wrong door." And then she walked back out into the prairie evening, and she found the hotel, and she paid for a room, and she sat on the edge of a bed with a wash basin and a single candle and a view of the darkening scrub, and she thought about a pair of gray-green eyes for much longer than she intended to. She learned his name the next morning. She came down to the hotel's small dining room for breakfast, which was served at a long common table, and she took a seat at the end and poured herself coffee from the pot the owner's wife, a stout and cheerful woman named Martha Prout, sat in the center. There were 4 other people at the table, a traveling dry goods salesman with enormous side whiskers, a young couple from the east who were heading further west to claim land, and the man from the dark corner. He was already seated when she came in, and when she walked through the dining room door, he stood again, this time from a chair at a breakfast table, which was an even more deliberate and unambiguous thing to do than standing in a saloon. The dry goods man looked at him with mild surprise. The young couple from the east exchanged a glance. Phineas Barker stood until Delia had taken her seat, and then he sat back down and resumed eating his eggs with the focused calm of a man who had done nothing unusual whatsoever. Delia looked at him across the table for a moment. Then she said, "You were in the saloon last night." "I was," he said. "You stood," she said. "My mother raised me correctly," he said, and went back to his eggs. Martha Prout, pouring more coffee and clearly enjoying herself, said, "That there's Phineas Barker, Miss Bancroft. He's been in town about a week ahead of you. Came in on the eastbound stage from El Paso." Delia looked at Martha, then back at Phineas Barker. He had set his fork down and was looking at her now with an expression that was careful and steady and revealed nothing beyond simple attention. "You know my name," Delia said. "Mrs. Prout told me a woman from St. Louis had sent ahead for a room," he said. "Redemption doesn't get many women from St. Louis." "What brings you to Redemption, Mr. Barker?" Delia asked, and she kept her voice level and polite, the voice she used when she was actually thinking hard about something. He paused for exactly 1 beat too long. "Land," he said, "same as most people out here." It was not a lie, she would eventually understand, but it was not the whole truth. And the space between those two things, in a room with a breakfast table and morning light coming through dusty windows, was the space where everything began. Delia Bancroft had arrived in Redemption with three objectives. She intended to purchase a piece of land. She intended to establish herself as a person of independent means. And she intended to spend no emotional energy whatsoever on any man for a period she was privately calculating as approximately the rest of her natural life. The betrayal she had survived innocent. Louis had not broken her. She was constitutionally disinclined to break, but it had stripped a layer of trust from her the way harsh weather strips paint from wood, and she felt rawer for it than she wanted to admit to anyone, including herself. The land question was practical and manageable. She had money from her father's estate, not a fortune but enough, and she had a head for numbers and a stubborn streak that had served her well in business dealings ever since she had spent 3 years helping her father manage his accounts. She had corresponded with a land agent in Redemption before making the trip, a man named Holt Prescott who ran the land office out of the back of the general store, and he had written her descriptions of several parcels that sounded promising for the small-scale cattle operation she had in mind. She met with Holt Prescott the morning after breakfast and found him to be exactly what she had expected. A compact, efficient man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the reading glasses of someone who spent more time with paper than people. He spread maps across a table and pointed out 3 parcels with a patience and a lack of condescension that she genuinely appreciated, because her experience had been that men in the West either dismissed women in business entirely or performed an elaborate theatrical version of taking her seriously that was almost worse. Holt Prescott just showed her the maps and answered her questions. She liked him immediately. What Holt said, as he was rolling the 3rd map back up, stopped her cold. "I should tell you," he said, not looking up from the map, "that there's been another buyer making inquiries about these same parcels. Been in town about a week." Delia Bancroft set down her coffee cup with a precision that was entirely deliberate. "Describe this other buyer," she said. "Tall man," Holt said. "Dark coat, name of Barker." She sat with that information for the rest of the morning. She sat with it through a walk along the main street in which she catalogued every business in Redemption and assessed the economic landscape with the thoroughness of her father's daughter. She sat with it through the purchase of supplies at the general store. She was still sitting with it, in the way that a stone sits at the bottom of a still pool, when she saw Phineas Barker coming out of the blacksmith's that afternoon, and their paths intersected in the middle of the dusty main street of Redemption as naturally as if it had been arranged. He stopped. She stopped. The afternoon wind pushed a tumbleweed between them with a timing so absurd it was almost literary. "Mr. Barker," she said. "Miss Bancroft," he said. "Are you interested in purchasing land in this territory?" she asked. Something moved behind his gray-green eyes, quick and careful. "I am," he said. "So am I," she said. "I've already spoken with Holt Prescott." "So have I," he said. She studied him for a moment. "I came a long way for this," she said. "It was not a threat. It was a fact stated with a quiet plainness that carried its full weight." He met her gaze and did not blink, but something shifted in his expression, not softened but opened like a shutter swinging back to admit more light. "So did I," he said just as plainly. "And I imagine neither of us is prepared to back down easily." "No," she said. "We are not." "Then perhaps," he said, "we ought to know each other better before this becomes a fight." She considered that for a moment while the wind pushed more dust between them. "Supper," she said. "The hotel dining room, 6 o'clock. You can tell me why you're really here." She walked away before he could respond, and she did not look back, because she was Delia Bancroft and looking back was not something she did. He was at the table at 5 minutes before 6. She arrived exactly at 6, because she was also not the kind of woman who arrived early to signal eagerness. Martha Prout had set them a small side table near the window, presumably because she was the sort of woman who understood that a conversation requiring honesty needed slightly more privacy than the common board. Delia sat. Phineas stood until she was seated. It was beginning to feel, she thought, like a language between them, this standing and being seated, A small repeated grammar of regard. They ordered. Martha brought steak and boiled potatoes and corn bread and a pitcher of water, and then she had the considerable grace to leave them alone. "You said I could tell you why I'm really here," Phineas said. "I did," Delia said, "and I expect you to." He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over in his hand. She noticed the hands of someone who had worked very hard for a long time, but with something else in them too, a precision, the way a man holds a tool when he respects it. "My father owned land east of here," he said. "About 30 miles. He built on it for 20 years. He died 4 years ago, and before he died he lost the land, lost it to a forged deed." Delia went very still. "A man came through this territory selling land surveys," Phineas continued. "Or what he said were land surveys. He convinced my father that the original claim on his property had a flaw in the title, and that for a fee he could rectify it. My father paid. The deed that came back wasn't worth the paper it was on. A forged seal, a forged title. 3 months later, someone else produced a real deed, and my father lost the land in a county court in San Angelo." "What was this man's name?" Delia asked. Her voice was absolutely level. She had trained it to be level in moments when her pulse was doing something violent and uncooperative. Phineas looked at her directly. "Martin Greer," he said, "though he may have used other names elsewhere." The room seemed to tilt very slightly. Delia set her fork down carefully on the edge of her plate. "He went by Martin Aldridge Greer in St. Louis," she said. Phineas Barker went very still. The silence between them was not empty. It was dense with the pressure of two people absorbing an enormous piece of information at the same time, like two people standing in the same room when lightning strikes outside the window, both of them illuminated by the same light. "He was engaged to you," Phineas said. "It was not quite a question." "He was," Delia said, "until a Pinkerton report arrived at my father's house in March of last year. The engagement ended. My father died in November, and I came to Texas to start over on solid ground." Phineas pressed his lips together for a moment, and in that moment Delia saw the full weight of what he was carrying, the 4 years of it, the loss of his father's land and the grief around his father's death, and the long, slow work of tracking a man who used different names in different territories with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. "You're not just here to buy land," Delia said quietly. "No," he said. "I'm here because Martin Greer has been operating in West Texas for the last several months. I have information suggesting he's using the land office in redemption as part of his current scheme. I've been corresponding with the Pinkerton Agency and with a federal land commissioner out of Austin." He paused. "I'm not here to interfere with your legitimate purchase, Miss Bancroft. On my honor." She looked at him for a long time. She was measuring him the way she measured everything, not with the instruments of suspicion exactly, but with the finely calibrated scale of someone who had learned that what people say and what they are can be very different weights. What she found on that scale was that he balanced out evenly. There was no performance in what he had just told her. There was grief, which was real, and purpose, which was focused, and something else she was not quite ready to name because she did not trust anything she felt toward a man who had been in her field of vision for less than 48 hours. "Then we have a common interest," she said. "It appears we do," he said. She picked up her fork. "Tell me everything you know about what he's doing in this county," she said, "and I will tell you everything I know from the Pinkerton report my father received. Between the two of us, we may have enough to stop him." Something happened in his expression then, something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the particular quality of a person who has been carrying something heavy alone for a very long time, suddenly understanding that they do not have to carry it alone anymore. "All right," he said. They talked for 3 hours. Martha Prout refilled their coffee twice and brought a slice of dried apple pie at some point, which neither of them ate until it was cold. By the time they had laid out everything they knew between them, the full picture that emerged was this. Martin Greer had arrived in West Texas the previous autumn and had been operating a scheme involving fraudulent land surveys. the same method he had used in Missouri and Kansas, but more sophisticated now, because he had apparently acquired a collaborator inside the land recording system itself. Someone in or near the official record-keeping apparatus of Sutton County was helping him register fraudulent claims, which made the scheme harder to unravel through simple legal challenge. If he has someone inside the official process, Delia said, then approaching the county recorder directly could alert his accomplice before the evidence is complete, which is what I have been trying to work out for 6 days, Phineas said. How to gather enough documentation to present directly to the federal commissioner without tipping off the local network. What documentation do you have so far? Delia asked. He reached under the table and produced the battered leather satchel she had noticed on the floor of the saloon the previous night. He opened it and spread papers across the table, survey maps, correspondence, a series of land transaction records that he had been collecting through a combination of public record requests and careful personal investigation. His work was thorough and methodical, and Delia, who had organized her father's accounts for years, could see the architecture of it clearly. "You're missing the originating document," she said, pointing to a gap in the chain of transactions. "The first claim registered under the fraudulent seal. If you can find that, you have the root, and everything growing from a rotten root falls with it." He stared at the papers for a moment, then looked at her. "I haven't been able to identify which claim is the root," he said. "There are 4 possibilities." "May I?" she said, reaching for the papers. He slid them toward her without hesitation, and she worked through them methodically for 20 minutes while he watched and refilled their coffee, and at the end of it she had identified the root claim with a confidence that surprised even her. It was a property registered in October of 1882 to a Thaddeus M. Rowlands, a name that appeared in no other record in the county before that date and in no record after it, a name designed to exist only long enough to anchor a fraudulent chain. "Thaddeus M. Rowlands," she said. "That's your starting point." Phineas Barker looked at the document she was pointing to, then at her, and in his expression there was something that was unmistakably admiration, the honest, uncomplicated kind, the kind that recognizes competence directly. "How did you see that so quickly?" he asked. "I managed my father's accounts from the time I was 16, she said. "When money goes somewhere it shouldn't, there's always a first wrong step. You look for the first number that doesn't match the logic of all the numbers before it. Land records are the same. The first false name is always the one that has no history on either side of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Bancroft, I think we may be more useful to each other than either of us anticipated." She looked at him, at the gray-green eyes and the worn coat, and the 4 years of grief and purpose contained in a man who had stood up in a room full of people who didn't, and she said, "I think you may be right." What followed was 10 days that Delia Bancroft would look back on for the rest of her life, as one of the most unexpectedly alive periods she had ever known, which was not something she would have predicted going into it, given that it involved a great deal of methodical paperwork and the persistent anxiety of investigating a criminal who had personally harmed both of them. They worked together every day. They divided the territory. Phineas pursued the documentary trail through official records, and Delia did what she was in many ways better positioned to do, which was move through the social fabric of redemption as a woman new to town and simply talk to people. She talked to shop owners, to the wives of ranchers who came in for supplies, to the minister's wife, to the women who washed clothes for the hotel. She drank coffee and listened, which she was very good at, and gradually assembled a picture of who knew what and who had been damaged by fraudulent land claims, and who might be willing to speak to a federal commissioner if assured of protection. She found 6 families who had been victimized. 6 families who had paid for surveys and titles that turned out to be worth nothing, who had lost land or money or both, who were living in a state of quiet desperation that they did not entirely understand because The mechanisms of how they had been robbed were too complicated for them to articulate to a county court. She documented every one of them with the same careful precision she had applied to her father's accounts, sitting at kitchen tables across the county, writing down names and dates, and amounts in a ledger she had purchased from the general store. She was systematic about it, and the people she interviewed responded to her with a trust that she recognized as partly personal. She was herself a woman who had been deceived and robbed by the same man, and partly something more fundamental, the particular relief of being taken seriously by someone who is genuinely trying to help. In the evenings, she and Phineas compared notes at the hotel dining table, or, when the weather was cooperating, which it did not always, at the small bench outside the hotel that faced the western sky. They had fallen into an easy working rhythm, the kind that develops between people who think similarly without being identical, who push each other's conclusions in useful directions. He was more methodical where she was more intuitive. She was better with people. He was better with the formal legal structure of the documentary case. Together, they were building something that was beginning to feel unassailable. What she was less organized about was what was happening in the spaces between the work. The way he poured her coffee before his own. The way he listened when she talked, not with the performance of listening that men sometimes used with women, the exaggerated attentiveness that was actually a form of condescension, but with the genuine, active quiet of someone actually thinking about what they were hearing. The way he never once suggested that she should leave the difficult parts to him, never implied that the investigation was his territory and she was a helpful accessory. He treated her contribution as equal because he assessed it as equal, and that was so different from what she was accustomed to that it kept catching her off guard, a small recurring surprise like stepping on a floor you expected to be higher. She also noticed, with the reluctant honesty she applied to herself, that she had begun to dress with slightly more care in the mornings, that she had purchased a length of green ribbon from the general store and used it in her hair, and then spent 20 minutes interrogating her own motivations before conceding that she knew perfectly well what her motivations were, and that the appropriate response was not self-deception. She had also noticed that on the evenings when they sat outside and the light went down, and redemption settled into its particular nighttime quiet, with the coyotes somewhere out in the scrub and the stars enormous and unobstructed over the flat Texas sky, Phineas Barker sometimes forgot to maintain his careful, steady expression, and let something else show through something that had the quality of longing, pointed in her direction, that he was apparently trying quite hard to keep at a respectful distance. She respected the distance. She was not ready to close it. She was not sure she would ever be ready to close it, because the betrayal she had survived had left her genuinely uncertain about her own judgment in matters of the heart, and that uncertainty was not the kind of thing that 10 days of working companionship could fully resolve. But she noticed, and noting it meant something, whether she was ready to act on it or not. On the 11th day, Martin Greer came to Redemption. She saw him first. She was in the general store buying candles when she saw him through the front window, walking along the main street with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not know he was being hunted. He was exactly as she remembered him, medium height, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the kind of easy practice smile that looked honest from a distance and was up close, the most precisely calibrated performance of honesty she had ever encountered. She stood behind a shelf of dry goods and watched him walk past, and the feeling that moved through her was not the grief or the rage she might have expected. It was something colder and more operational. It was the feeling of a circuit completing. He was here and she had 6 families documented, and Phineas had a documentary trail from October 1882 to the present, and the federal commissioner's agent was due in Redemption in 4 days. She needed to find Phineas. She found him at the land office, exactly where she expected him to be, sitting across from Holt Prescott with survey maps spread between them. She came in without knocking, which was not her habit, and both men looked up. "He's here," she said. Phineas stood. His expression shifted with a speed and completeness that she had not seen from him before, something focusing in him that she recognized as the transformation that occurs in a person when a long-held purpose suddenly becomes immediate. "Where?" he said. "Main Street, heading north. He's wearing a gray coat and a brown hat, and he looks like a man who is very comfortable here, which means he has established relationships with someone local already." She looked at Holt Prescott. "Holt, the man walking north on your main street right now is the man who has been filing fraudulent claims through your land office for the past 6 months. We believe he has a local collaborator. I want you to know that because I trust you, and because I believe you have been used without your knowledge." Holt Prescott's face went through several complex things in rapid succession. Then it settled into a grim and contained anger. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. They could not move against Greer before the federal commissioner's agent arrived, because their entire case depended on presenting it to a federal authority who could override the compromised local system. Moving too early would give Greer time to disappear, and he would disappear. Delia had absolutely no doubt about that, because he had done it before and before that and before that. The secret of his survival was speed, the ability to read a closing trap and vanish before it shut. What they needed to do was manage the next 4 days in a way that kept him from sensing the trap. Phineas and Delia talked through the evening and into the night, sitting in the hotel dining room long after Martha Prout had gone to bed and the candles had burned low, and they built a plan that was intricate but sound. Delia would proceed with her land negotiations as a visible, legitimate buyer, because Greer would recognize that a woman of means pursuing land was a potential target and would inevitably attempt to approach her. When he did, she would give him enough rope to demonstrate his methods clearly in front of a witness. Phineas would remain in the background, continuing his documentation, tracking Greer's movements and contacts to identify the local collaborator. The collaborator, they agreed, was likely someone with access to the official land records which, in redemption, meant one of 3 people: the county recorder himself, his assistant, or the notary public who authenticated claims. "If Greer approaches me," Delia said, "I want you to know that I am completely capable of managing that conversation without losing my composure." "I know you are," Phineas said, without hesitation, without the qualifying pause that would have indicated any doubt. She looked at him. "Most men would express some concern about putting a woman in that position," she said. "Most men," he said, "have not spent 11 days watching you systematically dismantle a fraud operation through sheer intelligence and nerve. I'm not in the habit of doubting the evidence in front of me." She felt the warmth of that move through her in a way she did not try to analyze or qualify. She just let herself feel it briefly and then moved on. "There is one other thing," she said. He waited. "If this goes wrong," she said, "if Greer senses what we are doing before the agent arrives, he will run. And if he runs, we may not get another chance. The families I have documented will have no recourse. Your father's land will stay lost." She paused. "I want you to know that I am committed to seeing this through regardless of what it costs me personally. I want you to know that because I need to know the same is true for you." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and whatever he was feeling was visible in his face in a way that his face did not usually permit, some combination of grief and gratitude and something she still was not ready to name, all of it present in the gray-green of his eyes without apology or management. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "I have spent 4 years pursuing this. There is no version of this situation in which I walk away." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." Martin Greer approached Delia on the 2nd day after his arrival, which was exactly as soon as she had predicted. She was outside the hotel in the morning light, reviewing the deed descriptions Holt Prescott had provided, when she heard a voice she knew with the particular intimacy of someone who had spent 2 years believing it belonged to someone honest. "Delia," he said, "I can hardly believe it." She turned. She kept her expression composed with a degree of effort that she suspected would have impressed a theater professional. He was smiling, the smile she knew, the one she had once read as warmth and now read as calculation, the smile of a man who had spent so long performing a character that the performance had eaten the man underneath. "Martin," she said, "of all the towns in Texas." "I thought you'd stayed in St. Louis," he said, coming forward with a careful ease. "After what happened, I thought you'd want to stay close to home." "My home is where I make it," she said. "I've come to buy land." He expressed concern for her, the scripted concern of a man who is rapidly calculating how a woman of independent means with land-buying intentions can be useful to him. He offered help. He mentioned that he had contacts in the local land market who could point her to the best opportunities. He mentioned his survey work with the practiced fluency of someone who had delivered the same lines so many times they no longer required thought. Delia listened. She asked questions that seemed naive and were not. She let him believe that she was what he needed her to be, a target who had come conveniently to him. And 3 feet around the corner of the hotel's exterior wall, in a position that the morning geometry of shadow and building made entirely invisible to anyone on the street, Phineas Barker stood and listened to every word, cataloging it all with the focused attention of a man who understood that what was happening in this conversation was the thread that, pulled correctly, would unravel everything. When Martin Greer was gone, Phineas stepped around the corner and looked at her. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. "I was functional," she said. "We know now that he has already prepared survey documents for the Callaway parcel, which is the parcel I told Holt I was most interested in. He'll bring those documents to me within the next 24 hours. When he does, we'll have him demonstrating the method directly." "We need one more thing," Phineas said. "The local collaborator." Greer mentioned the Callaway parcel without hesitation, which means he already has documentation prepared, which means the false deed was filed this morning or yesterday, which means whoever filed it did so in the last 48 hours. Delia looked at him. "Can Holt identify who processed filings in that window?" "I'm going to ask him," Phineas said. "Right now." The answer came back within the hour. The only person who had processed new filings in the past 2 days, aside from Holt himself, was his assistant, a young man named Clarence Webb who had come to Redemption 8 months ago from, and this was the detail that locked it, Kansas City. Kansas City, where the Pinkerton agency had traced Greer's operations before he moved to Texas. They had their collaborator. The challenge now was that Clarence Webb, once he sensed that his involvement was known, would alert Greer, and Greer would vanish. The federal commissioner's agent was still 2 days out. 2 days was an eternity for a man as practiced at disappearing as Martin Greer. Phineas and Delia walked the length of the main street and back, talking in low voices, while the midday sun made the dust shimmer and a couple of horses switched flies outside the feed store. This was the part of the plan they had not fully resolved, the gap between knowing and being able to act on knowing, the 2-day window in which everything could still fall apart. "We keep Clarence Webb from Greer for 2 days, Phineas said. "How?" Delia said. "Webb has to keep processing his normal work at the land office, or his absence will alert Greer immediately," Phineas said. "And Holt can't confront him without Greer knowing. But if Webb is busy, genuinely overwhelmed with legitimate work, he may not have time or opportunity to pass any warning." Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll file a claim." He looked at her. "I'll file a formal preliminary claim on the Callaway parcel today," she said. "A legitimate claim, properly documented, which will require Webb to process it through the full formal procedure. And then I'll find reasons to request amendments, clarifications, additional documentation, anything that keeps him occupied at the recorder's desk. I know enough about property documentation to make that process last 2 full days without it appearing artificial." Phineas looked at her with the expression she had begun to think of as his honest expression, the one he could not entirely control, which was the one that showed what he actually thought and felt without the careful management of his usual steadiness. What it showed in this moment was something that was larger than admiration, and not quite at the word she still, was not using. "You are," he said slowly, "the most formidable person I have encountered in 4 years of pursuing this." "I am motivated," she said. "There's a difference." "The difference," he said, "is entirely theoretical." She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, which was longer than she normally allowed herself. Then she turned and walked toward the land office, and he watched her go, and the afternoon wind moved through the street, and Redemption, Texas held itself in the particular suspension of a place where something large is about to happen. The next 2 days were the most operationally precise 2 days of Delia Bancroft's life, which was saying something given the precision of the 2 weeks preceding them. She filed her preliminary claim, and then proceeded to bury Clarence Webb in a blizzard of legitimate paperwork needs, returning to the land office 4 times each day with additional questions and requirements, all of which were entirely real and technically justified, and which collectively made it effectively impossible for Webb to leave the office long enough to have any meaningful conversation with Martin Greer. She did this with the focused, controlled energy of someone who has taken something that was a source of pain and transformed it into fuel, which was what the betrayal had given her, not just loss, but the motivation to ensure that no one else lost the same way. Phineas, meanwhile, was completing the documentary case with a thoroughness that left no procedural gaps. He worked with Holt Prescott to pull the original registration of the Thaddeus M. Rowlands claim, cross-referenced it against the seal of the county recorder's office, and identified the specific irregularity in the stamp that marked it as fraudulent, the kind of detail that required both intimate knowledge of authentic documents and the patience to look at a great many of them carefully. He secured written statements from 3 of the victimized families that Delia had documented, statements formal enough to stand as evidence before a federal commissioner. And on the afternoon of the day before the agent's scheduled arrival, Martin Greer came to Delia Bancroft at the hotel with a leather portfolio of survey documents and a smooth, practiced pitch for a land opportunity on the Callaway parcel. She sat across from him at the hotel dining table and listened to the entire pitch. She asked the questions a genuinely interested buyer would ask. She examined the documents he spread before her with an expression of careful consideration, and when she handed them back, she said she would like a day to think it over, which he accepted with the practiced patience of someone who had done this many times and knew that patience was the final instrument. What he did not know was that Phineas Barker had spent the previous night making exact copies of every fraudulent document Greer had provided to 3 of the 6 victimized families, and that those copies, together with the originating fraudulent claim, the evidence of the compromised seal, the chain of false names, and the signed statements from the victimized families, were in a leather satchel that was at that moment secured in Holt Prescott's safe. Waiting for a federal commissioner's agent named Chester Aldine, who arrived on the morning stage from San Angelo on April 27, 1883, and who spent 4 hours in the back of the general store reviewing the evidence that 2 people had assembled together out of a shared determination that began the night they sat at a hotel dining table and told each other the truth. Chester Aldine was a compact, precise man who wore a coat that was too heavy for the Texas weather, and who had the manner of someone who had seen a great deal of attempted fraud in his career and was not easily impressed. He was, however, clearly impressed by the documentation in front of him, and by the second hour of his review, he had stopped making small notes and had begun making larger ones. Martin Greer was taken into federal custody by Chester Aldine and 2 territorial officers who accompanied the agent on the afternoon of April 27, 1883, while he was crossing the main street of Redemption in the direction of the hotel, apparently unaware that his 2-day buffer had expired and his world was closing around him. Clarence Webb was taken into custody at the land office at the same moment, which was a coordination that Phineas had arranged with the methodical precision of someone who had been planning exactly this for 4 years. Delia watched it from the window of the hotel. She watched Martin Greer stop in the middle of the dusty street and realize what was happening, and she watched his face go through the sequence of expressions that belong to a man whose performance of honesty has finally met a reality it cannot navigate. Surprise, calculation, and then, under both of those, something exposed and small and human that she found she did not feel satisfaction at seeing. She had thought once that she would feel something triumphant in this moment. What she actually felt was a clean, quiet completion, like a debt settled or an account closed to zero. Not triumphant, just finished in the necessary direction. She felt Phineas come to stand beside her at the window, and she did not look at him because she did not need to. She could feel his presence with the same clarity with which she felt the afternoon light through the dusty glass. "It's over," he said. "For him," she said. "For the families, the work of recovery is just beginning. Chester Aldine has committed to a full audit of the county land records," Phineas said. "Every fraudulent transaction will be identified and reversed where possible. The families you documented will have their cases presented formally." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your father's land." He was quiet in return. "Chester believes the original claim can be reasserted. It will take time and a case in federal land court, but the fraudulent deed can be challenged now that the root document is identified." "Good," she said. Another moment of quiet. Outside, the territorial officers were escorting Martin Greer toward the stage office, and Clarence Webb was being brought from the land office direction, and a small crowd of Redemption's residents had gathered at a respectful distance to watch, with the contained, serious interest of people who have been living adjacent to an injustice they could not fully see and are now watching it become visible. "Delia," Phineas said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she registered it with the full attention her brain reserved for things that were significant. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the honest expression, the unmanaged one, and in it she could see all of it 4 years of grief and purpose and the peculiar relief of completion. And underneath those, the other thing, the thing she had been watching from a careful distance for 2 weeks, close enough to identify but not close enough to touch. "I came to Redemption to do one thing," he said. "I came to finish what started 4 years ago when my father lost everything. I didn't come expecting anything else. I didn't expect," he stopped, started again. "I didn't expect to find someone who made me realize I had also been missing something I hadn't known to look for." She held his gaze and did not look away, and the thing she had been keeping at arm's length moved closer of its own accord like the tide, which does not ask permission. "Phineas," she said, "I came here broken in a way I didn't want to admit. My trust in my own judgment was gone. I had a plan for the rest of my life that involved land and practical independence, and the total elimination of any situation in which I might be required to trust a man again." She paused. "You are making it very difficult to maintain that plan." He almost smiled. It transformed his face. She had seen him steady and thoughtful and focused and tired, but she had not seen him smile with the full unself-consciousness of a man who is genuinely happy in a moment, and she did not have a better word for it, it was a revelation. "I'm not in the habit of apologizing," he said, "for things I'm not sorry for." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came from somewhere real, somewhere that had been quiet for a long time, and it sounded, even to her own ears, like something returning. "Nor am I," she said. The federal case against Martin Greer moved with the methodical momentum of the Federal Land Commission, which was to say it moved slowly but inexorably. And over the following months, the full scope of his fraud was systematically documented, and the falsely obtained property was, where possible, returned to its rightful owners. Clarence Webb cooperated in exchange for reduced charges and provided testimony that filled the remaining gaps in the documentary trail. Delia purchased the Callaway parcel legally and without interference, filing her claim through the land office under the now uncorrupted process that Holt Prescott, freed of his compromised assistant and deeply committed to proper administration, implemented with something that could only be described as moral zeal. The parcel was 480 acres of mixed grass and scrub country with access to a reliable seasonal creek, and it was, in her considered professional assessment, exactly what she had come to Texas for. Phineas remained in redemption. He had, at some point in the weeks after the arrest, simply not left, and neither of them had spoken about this directly, because they were both people who preferred to let established realities speak for themselves rather than announcing them prematurely. He helped her with the Callaway land. He was not a man who interfered or directed or assumed authority he had not been given. He asked what she needed, and then provided exactly that, whether it was physical labor. And there was a great deal of physical labor in establishing a working cattle operation on raw West Texas land, or guidance from his own knowledge of ranching practices, which was considerable, his father having worked cattle in this same country for 2 decades. They worked alongside each other through the spring and into the summer of 1883, and the people of Redemption watched them with the interested affection that small communities extend to stories unfolding in real time, and Martha Prout told anyone who would listen that she had known from the second morning, when the man had stood up from the breakfast table, that this was going somewhere significant. Phineas had taken a room at the Pico's house on a monthly basis, and Delia was spending her days at the Callaway land as the construction of a small ranch house began, coming back to the hotel in the evenings with dust in her hair and a particular quality of tiredness that was not the exhaustion of suffering but the exhaustion of building, which is a fundamentally different thing and feels different in the body. On an evening in June, when the air had gone warm and the last light was going gold and long over the flat country west of town, they sat on the bench outside the hotel as they often did, and the conversation moved in its usual way through practical things, the progress of the house, the fencing schedule, the cattle he was helping her source from a ranch south of San Angelo, and then shifted, as it sometimes did now, into something quieter. "I've been thinking," Phineas said. "You are frequently thinking," she said. "You'll have to be more specific." He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing something to his face that made the gray-green of his eyes very clear. "I've been thinking about my father's land. Chester Aldine's office has confirmed that the federal case is strong enough to challenge the fraudulent deed in the San Angelo land court. The hearing is scheduled for September." "I know," she said. "You told me last week." "What I didn't tell you," he said, "is that I've been thinking about what I want to do with it if the land is recovered." She waited. "My father built on that land for 20 years, he said. "He built a house and a working ranch. When he lost it, he lost not just the land but the thing he had made on it, the thing he wanted to leave." He paused. "I want to rebuild it, not alone." Delia was quiet for a moment. The sun was reaching the horizon, and the sky was going through its western performance of color, the deep golds and corals that the Texas sky produced with a lavishness that still surprised her after 3 months of watching it. "Phineas," she said carefully, "I have my own land." "I know," he said. "I came here to be independent," she said. "I came here to build something that was mine, on my own terms. That matters to me in a way that I need you to understand completely." "I understand it completely," he said. "I'm not asking you to give up what you've built. I would never ask that." His voice was very steady, the way it was when he meant something entirely. "I'm asking if you would consider building something with me in addition to what you've built for yourself. I'm asking if your Callaway land and my father's land might in time, and on whatever terms you decide are right, belong to both of us." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the sky began its transition to the deep blues of prairie evening. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I'm working up to it," he said, with the quality of honesty that had characterized everything he had ever said to her. "I realize I haven't done it elegantly. "I don't particularly care about elegance," she said. "That," he said, "is one of approximately 75 things I love about you." The word arrived between them in the prairie air and rested there, and Delia Bancroft, who had rebuilt her trust from nothing and her future from a train ticket and a carpet bag, felt the last of the distance she had been keeping close it, not with a collapse but with a voluntary, clear-eyed step forward. "Ask me," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring. It was not elaborate, a simple band of gold with a single small garnet set flush, the kind of ring that a man bought from a jeweler in San Angelo on a trip that he had planned and made and said nothing about. She had thought he went to San Angelo to pick up fencing supplies. He had done that too. He said, "Delia Bancroft, you are the most formidable, most honest, most remarkable person I have ever known. I stood up when you walked into a room full of people who didn't, and I did it because something in me recognized, before I knew your name or your history or anything else about you, that you were someone worth standing for. I want to spend the rest of my life standing for you, and with you, and I am asking you, on honest terms and with my whole heart, to marry me." She looked at the ring, and then at him, and then at the ring again. And then she said yes with a quiet decisiveness that was exactly consistent with every other decision she had made in her life. And he placed the ring on her hand, and she turned it to catch the last of the daylight, and the garnet caught the color of the sky. They were married in September of 1883 in the small church in Redemption that leaned slightly to the east, by the minister whose wife had been one of the first people Delia had spoken to when she arrived in town. Martha Prout cried visibly and made no attempt to conceal it. Holt Prescott served as one of the witnesses, and the other was a rancher named Gus Fernandez who had become, over the summer months of building the Callaway operation, one of the people Delia had come to trust with the same straightforward instinct with which she trusted everything she had tested and found solid. The federal land court in San Angelo ruled the same month that the deed to Phineas's father's land was fraudulent and invalid, and the proper title reverted to the Barker estate. It was, by that point, the Barker marriage estate, and the legal proceedings that followed placed both parcels, the Callaway land and the elder Barker's land, in a combined holding that was registered jointly, which Delia had requested, and which Phineas had not only agreed to but had been the first to suggest. They moved between the two properties through the autumn of 1883, dividing their time according to the demands of the season and the work, which were considerable and satisfying in the specific way of things that are genuinely yours and genuinely hard-earned. The ranch house on the Callaway land was completed in November, a two-story structure that was modest by the standards of the East but was, by every measure of the frontier, a serious and permanent building, the kind that says its occupants intend to stay. The rebuilding of the Barker family property east of Redemption was a longer project, because the house that had stood on it was gone, dismantled by the fraudulent owners in the years between the loss and the recovery, and starting from a foundation was a task that would take most of the following year. But they had the winter for planning, and they planned with the same methodical care they had applied to everything else, spreading paper on the kitchen table of the Callaway house, and designing a structure that was practical and well-suited to the land and contained, in its dimensions and its plan, a room that Phineas described as, "for whatever comes next." What came next arrived in the summer of 1884. Delia told him on a morning in June, in the kitchen of the Callaway house with coffee going on the stove, and the light coming in at the angle that made the whole room look like something you might want to paint if you had the skill. She told him directly, without preamble, because that was how she told things, and she watched his face go through something extraordinary, something that moved through him visibly, like weather, like a thing too large to contain entirely. And what landed on the far side of it was the purest happiness she had ever seen on a human face, and she was the cause of it, and that knowledge was almost too much to hold. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, and she thought, with the precise clarity that characterized her thinking even in moments of overwhelming feeling, that she had been right about him from the beginning. From the moment in the Silver Spur saloon when a room full of men sat and he stood. She had not known yet what it meant, but she had registered it with something deeper than conscious recognition, and everything that had followed the work, the investigation, the long conversations in candlelight, the standing beside each other at windows and on benches and in the middle of dusty streets, had been the unfolding of what that first moment had meant. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the room of the Calloway house during a hard-blowing norther that rattled the windows and kept the fire going all night. The doctor came from Redemption, and Martha Prout came too, because she had been involved in everything else, and there was no reasonable argument for excluding her from this. Phineas spent a great deal of the night doing various practical things that Martha found for him to do, because she was wise enough to know that a man who cannot sit still needs tasks, and Delia spent the night doing the hardest work of her life, with the focused determination that characterized everything she did. And at 3 in the morning on a February night in 1885, a boy arrived in the world with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's expression of complete self-possession. And Phineas Barker held his son for the first time with the particular careful reverence of a man who understands the full weight of what he is holding. They named him James, after Phineas's father, which Delia had suggested, and Phineas had accepted with the wordless gratitude of a man who did not trust himself to speak it adequately. The Barker property east of Redemption was completed in the spring of 1886, and it was everything the original had been and more: a working ranch house with a proper barn, and a bunkhouse for the hands they had hired, and fencing that extended across the full acreage of both parcels, which, combined, made the Barker operation one of the more substantial in that part of West Texas. They ran cattle on the eastern property and maintained the Calloway land as a mixed operation, and the work was constant and real in theirs. James grew from an infant to a toddler to a small, serious boy who was fascinated by horses and by the mechanical operation of anything with moving parts, and who had, from a very early age, the habit of standing very still and watching things with a focused attention that everyone who saw it recognized as belonging entirely to his mother. In the spring of 1887, Delia discovered she was expecting again, and she told Phineas in the same kitchen, at the same table with the same directness, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, the weather moving through it, the happiness arriving enormous and uncontained on the far side. "You might try to look slightly less overwhelmed," she said, smiling. "You knew this was a possibility." "The theoretical knowledge and the actual event," he said, "remain completely different experiences, and I cannot apologize for that." She laughed. James looked up from the wooden horse he was examining on the kitchen floor and considered his parents with the focused attention that was his primary mode of engaging with the world. Their second child arrived in November of 1887, a girl this time, and they named her Vera, which was a name Delia had carried in the back of her mind without knowing why, until she saw her daughter's face and understood that the name had been waiting for the face it belonged to. Vera arrived in the world with opinions and the volume to express them, and it became clear within her first weeks that she had inherited the particular force of her mother's personality in a concentrated form, which Phineas found endlessly entertaining, and which Delia found both vindicating and, when it was directed at her, moderately exhausting. The Barker household was, by the winter of 1887, a full and complicated and deeply happy place. There were 2 children and a working ranch, and the daily negotiations of a life built together by 2 people who were both strong-willed and practically minded, and who had learned, through the particular education of loving someone you have genuinely chosen, that strength and practicality are not obstacles to intimacy, but are, when combined with honesty and respect, the foundations of it. They argued sometimes because they were both constitutionally disinclined to defer when they believed they were right, and the arguments were real and occasionally heated and always resolved, not through one of them capitulating, but through the genuine process of two people working through a disagreement until they found the point of agreement underneath it, which was always there because they were always, fundamentally, working toward the same things. Phineas had a habit, on evenings when an argument had been resolved and the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet, of finding wherever Delia was and simply sitting near her, not necessarily talking, just present in the way he had been present since the beginning, steady and real, and pointed in her direction. She had learned to recognize this as his version of a peace offering, and she had learned to receive it as such, which was one of the small private grammars of their marriage. She had her own version, which was making his coffee the way he liked it in the morning before he asked, which was the kind of small preemptive care that she would not have described as romantic to anyone who asked, because it was too domestic and too specific to their own particular logic to translate, but which Phineas received every time with an expression that told her it translated perfectly. In the spring of 1889, the Federal Land Commission completed its final review of all cases connected to the Greer fraud operation, and the last of the contested parcels in Sutton County were resolved. 3 of the 6 families Delia had documented recovered all or part of what they had lost. 2 more received partial compensation from the fraudulently obtained funds that had been seized as part of the federal prosecution. The 6th family had moved on by then, westward into New Mexico territory, and their case was forwarded to the appropriate federal authority there. Martin Greer was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of obtaining property under false pretenses, and was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary at Huntsville. Clarence Webb received 3 years, having cooperated fully with the prosecution. The sentences were delivered by a federal judge in San Angelo, and neither Delia nor Phineas attended the sentencing, because neither of them had any remaining business with Martin Greer, and the thing about closing a chapter is that you close it and turn the page. The people of Redemption knew the outlines of the Barker story, as small towns always know the outlines of the stories that happen in them, and what they knew had given the couple a particular standing in the community, the standing of people who had done something real and difficult and had done it together. Delia was involved in the formation of a small school in Redemption in 1888, which the community had been trying to organize for several years without success, and which she brought to completion through the same systematic combination of practical organization and persistent human engagement that had characterized everything she had done since arriving in Texas. The school opened in September of 1888 with 14 children, including James, and a teacher recruited from a teacher training institution in Austin. Phineas served for 2 years as a volunteer mediator in the informal disputes over land boundaries and grazing rights that were the constant background friction of ranching country, a role he was given because people trusted him to apply both fairness and knowledge to problems that were otherwise expensive to resolve in court. He did it with the same methodical steadiness with which he did everything, and he was good at it, and he found it satisfying in a way that he told Delia one evening was about his father, about honoring the memory of a man who had loved this land and lost it to dishonesty, by helping others keep what was rightfully theirs. She had listened to him say this, and then she had said, "Your father would be very proud of you." And she said it without decoration because she meant it exactly as stated, and he had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when something went directly to the place where he kept the things he felt most fully. In the summer of 1890, they rode out together one morning to the far eastern boundary of the Barker property, the original parcel his father had worked for 20 years. It was early morning, and the grass was still cool, and the sky was the enormous unobstructed blue of the Texas summer morning, and they rode side by side in comfortable silence, as they often did, because they were people who had always been able to sit with the absence of words without it feeling like absence. At the eastern boundary, there was a stand of live oak that had been there before the fence and before the house and before any human claim on the land. And under the largest oak, facing east, Phineas's father had placed a simple stone marker that identified the property by name. The Barker Ranch, J.H. Barker, established 1863. The stone had survived the years of fraudulent occupation unchanged, because it was just a stone with letters cut into it, and the people who had taken the land had not thought it worth removing. Phineas dismounted and stood before the stone, and Delia dismounted and stood beside him, and the morning was very quiet except for the wind in the oak leaves and the somewhere distant sound of cattle. "He never thought he'd lose it," Phineas said. "No," she said. "And he did, and it came back." He was quiet for a moment. Not to him, he didn't live to see it, but to us. He paused again. "That's something." Delia put her hand in his, which was not a gesture she made casually, but which in this moment was the only precise response to what he had said. He held it the way he held things he valued, with care and with certainty, not so tight as to constrain, not so loose as to let go. "He did live to build it," she said. "The building was his. The returning was ours. Both of those things are true, and both of them matter." He looked at her, and what was in his eyes was the full depth of everything they had made together, the shared purpose that had brought them to the same town by different roads, the investigation and the arrest, and the long working partnership that had become a marriage and a family and a life, the 2 children and the 2 properties, and the school and redemption, and the evenings on the bench outside the hotel that had long since become evenings on the porch of the Calloway house, watching the same western sky. The standing and the being stood for, all of it present in the gray-green of his eyes on a summer morning under a live oak tree. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say, because she already knew what it was and the knowing was sufficient. He smiled. The full, unself-conscious smile she had first seen in the hotel dining room, and that still, after 7 years, arrived in her chest with the quality of something that never quite lost its first surprise. They rode back together through the morning grass, and the Barker Ranch spread out around them in every direction, solid and real and theirs. And redemption, Texas, was on the horizon ahead of them, the church leaning slightly east as always, the main street catching the early sun, the Silver Spur Saloon with its door facing west, and the whole forward arc of a life that had begun with a door opened by mistake and a single man rising to his feet in a room full of people who stayed seated. He had been the only one in the room who stood when she walked in, and neither of them, by any reasonable calculation, would ever be the same. By the fall of 1891, the Calloway land had expanded through the legal purchase of an additional parcel to the south, and the Barker operation was the kind of thing that people in the county described as established, which was a word that carried real weight in West Texas, where the land had a way of resisting permanence, and where the things that lasted did so because of genuine commitment and genuine work. James was 6 years old and Vera was 4, and the house was full of the noise and motion of children who were being raised by 2 people who took the work of raising seriously. Delia taught James reading and arithmetic with the same systematic rigor she had brought to everything else, and Phineas took him out to the barn and the pastures with the patient thoroughness of a man who believed that understanding how things work is the foundation of everything else. Vera, who had strong opinions about what she was and was not interested in learning, was discovered at age 4 to have a remarkable facility with numbers that she applied primarily to calculating whether any given situation was fair to her, which Delia found both a source of profound parental recognition and, on a daily basis, a formidable challenge. They were a household of considerable character. On the evening of Phineas and Delia's 8th wedding anniversary, which fell in September 1891, Phineas arranged for Martha Prout, who had become over the years one of the essential people in both their lives, the kind of person you cannot imagine the story going right without, to take the children for the evening at the hotel, which was still the Picots' house and still Martha's domain. Martha received this assignment with an enthusiasm that strongly suggested she had been expecting to be asked for some time. Phineas made supper. He was not an accomplished cook, which Delia knew very well, but he made the attempt with the thoroughness that characterized his approach to everything, and the result was a reasonable steak and very good cornbread, and a bottle of wine that he had ordered from San Angelo 3 weeks in advance, which was a planning horizon that she found, when she learned of it afterward, deeply characteristic and entirely charming. They ate at the kitchen table of the Calloway house, with the autumn evening going dark outside the windows, and the oil lamp making the room warm and close. And they talked as they always did, as they had done since the first real conversation at the hotel dining table in April of 1883, with the ease and the depth of two people who have learned how to hear each other completely. At some point, after the supper things were cleared and the wine was half gone and the evening had settled into its particular quality of peaceful, Phineas said, "I want you to know something." "You generally do," she said. 8 years ago, he said, "I came to redemption for one reason, and it was a reason that had nothing to do with what my life actually needed. I knew what I was pursuing, but I did not know what I was missing. And then a woman walked through the wrong door into a room full of men who didn't have the sense or the decency to stand, and I stood because my mother raised me correctly, but also," he paused, "also because something in me knew. Before I knew anything else, I knew that was someone worth standing for." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this man who had chosen her clearly and consistently, and without apology from the very first moment. This man who had worked beside her and built beside her and trusted her judgment and held her firmly and let her be exactly what she was without requiring her to be smaller or different or more convenient. And she felt the full accumulated weight of 8 years of that, not heavy but dense, the density of something rich and real. "You know what I knew," she said. "In that moment," he waited. "I knew that I was done pretending I didn't need people," she said. "Not in general, just one person who was genuinely worth needing." And standing in the doorway of that ridiculous saloon, looking at the one man in the room who had the instinct to rise, I thought, there is a person who understands what other people are worth. She paused. "I didn't know yet if you'd prove it, but I thought it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his in return. "Did I prove it?" he said. "Don't be fishing," she said, but she was smiling, and he was smiling, and the kitchen was warm and the children were accounted for, and the ranch outside was solid and real in all directions. And redemption, Texas held them in the specific way that a place holds people who have made it genuinely theirs. "Yes," she said, after a moment, because honesty mattered and the honest answer was also the one that happened to be beautiful. "You proved it completely." The years that followed were full ones, in the way of lives that are genuinely lived. There were good seasons and difficult ones, because West Texas offered nothing consistently except wind and stubbornness, and the cattle business required both of those and more. There were negotiations and neighbors and community disagreements about water rights and fencing, and the arrival of the railroad through the county in 1893, which changed the economics of everything and required the kind of rapid reassessment of plans that Delia handled with her usual pragmatic intelligence. There were years when the rain came right and years when it didn't, and through all of it the Barker operation persisted and grew with the slow, solid momentum of something built on honest ground. James grew into a quiet, serious boy of 11 who read voraciously, and was developing a facility for the mechanical systems of the ranch that reminded Delia sharply of the way she had cataloged her father's accounts, the same instinct to understand how the parts created the whole. Vera, at 9, was a force of nature who had informed her parents that she intended to be a lawyer when she grew up, which Delia privately considered entirely plausible, and Phineas privately considered inevitable. In 1894, a third child arrived, another boy, and they named him Thomas, and he was from his earliest days the sunniest of the three, the child who woke happy and went to sleep happy, and navigated the intervening hours with a warmth and an easy generosity that Delia found slightly baffling from the perspective of genetic inheritance, but deeply welcome in the household ecology. The school in Redemption grew to serve 30 children by 1894 and had added a second teacher, a young woman from San Antonio named Frances Holt, who became a genuine friend to Delia in the specific way of women who recognize each other as serious people and find that recognition mutually relieving. Phineas's reputation in the county as a fair and reliable mediator had by this point translated into a more formal role. In 1893, he was asked to serve on the County Land Commission, a body that had been reorganized after the Greer fraud revelations to include members who were not employed by or connected to any land office, and he served on it with the same patient steadiness he brought to everything for 4 years. They were, by any honest accounting, happy. Not in the way of people who have been exempted from difficulty, but in the way of people who have met difficulty together and found that meeting it together was itself a form of richness. Their arguments remained real and their resolutions remained genuine. Their silences remained comfortable. Their mornings began with coffee and their evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was settling, often ended on the porch with the Texas sky doing whatever it was doing, which was always worth watching. One evening in the autumn of 1896, Phineas found Delia standing at the kitchen window in the last of the light, looking out at the land to the west where the grass was going gold with the season, and the sky was its spectacular end-of-day self, and he came to stand beside her, and they looked at it together in silence for a little while. "Do you miss St. Louis?" he said. She considered the question genuinely, which was the only way she considered questions. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss the smell of the Mississippi in the morning. I miss certain things that are particular to cities." She paused. "But I don't miss the life I thought I was going to have there. I don't miss it at all." "What do you have instead?" he said, and there was something playful in it, a quality she had learned to love in him, the dry lightness that appeared when he was entirely at ease. She looked at him with the direct, clear gaze she had always given him, and gave him now without reservation, without the distances and qualifications of the woman who had walked through a wrong door in April of 1883. "Everything," she said. "I have everything instead." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. And outside the kitchen window the West Texas evening went on doing what it did, enormous and unstinting, and the Barker ranch held them in the full, real, completed weight of a life that had been chosen clearly and built honestly and lived together. From the moment, a man stood up in a room full of people who stayed seated. All the way to this quiet kitchen and this particular golden light, and the sound of 3 children somewhere in the house behind them and the whole long future stretching out ahead, solid as the land beneath their feet, and as genuinely theirs.